Hello and welcome back to The AuDHD Teacher. I'm Emily, an early childhood teacher sharing stories, science, and honest conversations about living with an AuDHD brain. Whether you've been here since the trailer, you've just listened to episode 1, or you've just stumbled across this podcast somehow, I am really, really glad that you're here. Before we get started, just a quick reminder that I am sharing my own personal lived experience. So this podcast is not intended to diagnose or replace any medical advice. If you have any concerns about yourself or someone, please talk with a qualified healthcare professional. Now, to today's episode. Have you ever wondered what AuDHD actually is? Maybe you've seen the term on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, or maybe a friend has mentioned it. Or maybe you listened to the first episode and thought, oh, you've told me your story, but what actually is AuDHD? So that's exactly what I'm going to talk about today. AuDHD is actually a relatively new term because back in the day, they didn't actually think that you could have both ADHD and autism, but now they have discovered that you can. So it's still a fairly new diagnosis. Before my own diagnosis, I would have never thought that someone could have had AuDHD either. A lot of my understanding before I started delving into this world was based on typical stereotypes that I think a lot of people still have today. I thought that autism looked one particular way, and I thought that ADHD looked another way. And I never thought that I fit the typical description for either, especially ADHD, until I realized that there are actually two types of ADHD. And I think this is one of the reasons why I wanted to make this podcast, because I'm definitely not an expert and I definitely don't know everything, nor do I have all the answers. But I just remember how confusing it was and how alone I felt when I started learning about it. And I feel like, especially with social media now, there are a lot of different opinions, and you kind of can find yourself wondering which part of it is actually true. So, going back to basics, as you have probably guessed by now, AuDHD is autism and ADHD together. I, for one, am really, really thankful that research has changed and we've caught up, and we now have discovered that people can have both. Otherwise, I would not have been diagnosed, which has been a really big insight into my life. And it explains a lot because I don't think that my traits didn't fit neatly into one box. And I'm just really thankful. I may have mentioned this in my first podcast, but I was a little bit surprised to be diagnosed with ADHD because I think that I had that stereotype ADHD in my brain, like the naughty boy in the classroom that disrupts everyone. And I was completely opposite to that, but I was inattentive. So I was a really quiet, pleasure to have in the classroom kind of kid, but I was not there most of the time. I didn't speak. I was pretty much in a daydream world most of the time. So I have inattentive ADHD, but there are a lot of overlap between ADHD and autism as well. But then there are also a lot of opposite things. So it is quite complicated. I know for me, it's really confusing because one part of my brain really loves routine and being organized, planning ahead, having structure. And then the other part of my brain really wants novelty, and it gets very distracted in between tasks. And I find it very confusing because the autistic side of me really doesn't. So for me, I can find it really conflicting. So because the autistic side of me really likes to have routine, I like to plan everything out. I like predictability, knowing what's happening. But then the ADHD side of me really craves newness and novelty, and it really doesn't fit with the autistic side of me. So I'm always having these opposing challenges all the time. I think there are quite a few examples like that that made me doubt whether I was autistic or ADHD when I first started looking into it, because I thought that you couldn't have such opposing things. So for me, again, I am thankful because I finally have the language to describe my experience and describe my entire life. And I think that's really freeing. I know in terms of autism, there are still a lot of people out there that have the typical stereotypes, and they think that just because someone can make eye contact or they make friends or they're able to care for the people around them, that they can't have autism. And that is really totally wrong. I think for me, I did all of those things. And the more I learned about it, the more I realized that making eye contact was something I forced myself to do. It wasn't necessarily comfortable. And I found that I was constantly counting the seconds, how long I would make eye contact with someone. And it meant that I wasn't able to process a lot of the other things that were happening. And it made it really hard to then concentrate on what the person was saying because you have all these other sensory things around you in the environment as well. I've been doing a lot of reading and listening about autism in particular, and there is new research to show that autistic people are actually more empathetic, but socially they don't always know how to express it. So it looks like they maybe don't care about the people around them. So there is a lot of new research, and I just think the typical stereotypes we have in society don't show us that side of things. I also think a really important thing for me wasn't just what people saw on the outside. A lot of what happens for me is internally, and it's about how I experience the world internally. I think one of the biggest things for me was trying to work out the rules that felt like everyone else knew automatically. So, because social situations don't come with an instruction manual, I would remember leaving conversations, replaying them over and over because I wanted to figure out, had I done things right? Did I interrupt this person? Was I talking too much? Did I not talk enough, maybe? When they said that thing, were they being serious or were they joking? Did they actually want to be there having that conversation or were they being polite? And those are the types of things I analyze every single day. And I think because I've just done that for as long as I can remember, I honestly thought that everyone did the same thing. And it never occurred to me that there were people out there that could simply have a conversation and then move on with their day. Like, to me, that sounds completely impossible. Another thing that really resonates with me is sensory processing. So, again, before learning a lot more about autism, I thought that sensory differences meant things like covering your ears or not liking loud noises. I actually do things like cover my ears sometimes now that I've unmasked a little bit, but I never used to do it before because I think that behavior was really frowned upon. So that's a part of me that I used to mask. But I thought that that was all that sensory processing looked like, but it's actually a lot broader than that. For me, it often feels like my brain struggles to filter information. So, a really good scenario to imagine could be walking into a busy cafe. Most people can tune out the background noise and focus on the person that they're talking to in that busy cafe, but my brain will notice everything. I will notice the coffee machine sound, the music that's playing, the conversation of the people who are sitting next to me, maybe, the chairs that are scraping across the floor, the lights, the smell of the coffee, someone walking past, the air conditioning, the dog barking outside, every single thing my brain is trying to process. You can imagine that with your brain trying to do all of that, it becomes very exhausting. And I think we need to change the story that society has where sensory processing is reflected as a person cannot cope because it's not that at all. It's that your brain is working so incredibly hard. Of course, it's exhausting. And that's something that I never understood before I was diagnosed. I used to think maybe I was just really sensitive. And now I understand that my nervous system just processes the world differently. And I think that makes it easier for me in the way that I talk to myself. So instead of asking myself, why am I like this? I have now been able to start shifting that into asking myself, what would make this situation easier for my brain? So sometimes that might be wearing noise canceling headphones, or it might be taking 5 quiet minutes before walking into a busy room, or even after. Sometimes I'll go home, lay down in the dark with noise cancelling headphones just to allow myself that space after a really sensory heavy experience. And sometimes it might look like leaving early because I've realized over time that I don't need to push myself to the point where I'm completely overwhelmed, because it's a lot harder to come back down once you're at that point. And these are absolutely not things to be seen as weaknesses. They're supports. They're supports to help you. And everyone needs supports. Another really big part of autism, but also does come into ADHD in a slightly different way, is having really deep interests. So now I call them passions because they bring me so much joy. When I was growing up, I used to call them obsessions because I didn't have any other language for it. But basically, when I discover something that fascinates me, I don't just learn a little bit about it. I want to know everything. I read books, I listen to podcasts, watch documentaries, I'll listen to audiobooks, I'll buy all the things that there is to do with whatever it is. I go completely headfirst into things, and it becomes so exciting that it's actually kind of hard to sleep sometimes. I'll be honest about that. I think that my curiosity has been one of the favorite parts of who I am, actually. It's one of the reasons that I became a teacher, and then also one of the reasons I did my master's degree. And that may be also one of the reasons that you're listening to this podcast right now as well. Because once I become interested in something, I love sharing it with other people. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I think that's something to celebrate. I think one of the coolest things that we can do is share knowledge. And that's something that has always been there. And I think having a diagnosis helped me understand why I feel those passions so intensely. And instead of seeing it as something strange, I think it's actually one of my biggest strengths. So I really hope that that's something this podcast reminds you of too, because sometimes the things that we've spent years trying to hide are actually the things that make us who we are. Now to talk a little bit about the ADHD side. And this is one of the areas where I think there's a lot of myths. And I'll be honest, this is the area that I've probably done less reading and research about, because I've really delved into the autistic side of it. And I still have so much to learn about the ADHD side as well. But when I was younger, if someone asked me to describe ADHD, as I said earlier, it would have been the boy who's running around the classroom disturbing everyone and who was unable to sit still, because that's what I thought ADHD had to look like. And that's why I thought I never had ADHD, because I wasn't like that at all. I was never the loud child in the classroom. I wasn't climbing on tables. I wasn't getting into trouble. I never got into trouble. I was so quiet. I did struggle to sit still, but I think when I was told to do something, I would just do it, because I've been taught from a really young age to comply with instructions. But once I started learning more about ADHD, it kind of helped me make sense of some of the pieces in my life. I like to call ADHD an attention regulation difference rather than an attention deficit, because it's not necessarily that people with ADHD can't pay attention. It's that our brains have difficulty deciding what deserves our attention and when. So if something is really interesting, exciting, new, or urgent, I can focus for hours without even noticing time passing. You know, I'll forget to go to the bathroom. I won't realize that it's getting dark outside. I won't remember to eat, because my brain is completely immersed in whatever I'm doing. But if something feels too repetitive or overwhelming and just doesn't spark that same level of interest, it's a completely different story. And it doesn't matter how important it is, and it doesn't matter if it's only going to take 10 minutes of my time. Sometimes my brain just won't. It won't start, and it will not allow me to start. And that's incredibly frustrating, because on the outside, it looks like procrastination and laziness, and it looks like someone who's avoiding taking responsibility. But inside, that's not what it feels like at all. It kind of feels like standing at the bottom of a staircase, knowing exactly where you need to go, wanting to climb the stairs, but somehow your legs won't move. You know exactly what needs to happen. You want to make it happen, but there's a kind of, it's almost like there's some invisible barrier that you just cannot get through. If you've experienced that, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about and how it feels. But if you haven't, that's totally okay too. One of my goals for this podcast is to help people understand experiences that might be very different from their own because we are not all the same. We will not have the exact same experiences. And I think it's really important to understand different experiences as well because it helps expand our knowledge and our understanding to help support others a lot better. Another thing that I think it took me a while to get my head around was time blindness. So, if you haven't heard of time blindness before, it's not that you can't see the time, it's more that your brain experiences time differently. So, sometimes 5 minutes feels like 30 minutes, but sometimes 3 hours could go by and you don't even notice because it feels like 5 minutes. I've actually been doing this a lot recently where I'll sit down to do some writing and I have no idea how 4 hours have gone by because it literally feels like 10 minutes. And it did take me a long time to get my head around this because I wasn't fully sure that it was something that I experienced. But the more I paid attention to what I was doing, the more I realized that I do experience that a lot. I also still find it confusing because I think the autistic side of me likes to be very, very organized. So sometimes I will plan things out in terms of timings in the day, and I have a very rigid routine. So that does help me not to get so locked into this time blindness. There are very rare occasions where I will, but most of the time I have a pretty rigid routine to kind of keep me in place. But I think it's really important to help recognize your patterns and also give you a reason why you do things. And it's not to blame something else, but it's to help recognize, which then can help you put supports in place for yourself. So, whether that's timers or reminders, maybe you could try visual schedules or calendar alerts. There are lots of different things that can help. And none of that is to say that you're incapable because you're not, but you just need to have that extra support in place. And it's the same, like, I think we all need supports in place. Like, some of us wear glasses. Sometimes we use a GPS to help us know where we're going. It's just, these things are just another form of support that we can use to help us to help ourselves. So we've talked a little bit about autism and a little bit about ADHD. There is so much to be talked about there. But anyway, basics. But what happens when you have both? So this is the part that kind of changed how I understood myself because, again, I just thought I contradicted myself, the part of me that desperately wants routine. But then the next day I'll feel trapped by routine and I need some newness in my life. I think for a really long time, I just thought I was indecisive. But now I realize it was my brain trying to balance two very different needs at the same time. One of the biggest parts for me, which comes into my work in teaching, is the socializing side because while I do love people and I love having conversations, my sister actually said to me today that I talk quite a lot. I love spending time with my friends and catching up, but I also need a lot of alone time. And that's not because I don't enjoy spending time with people, because I really do. But my brain gets so tired, and it's like my social battery just drains so fast, so fast. And I think for a really long time, I would force myself to keep going because I would see everyone else around me managing, and I would wonder why I couldn't manage like that. I've spent a lot of my life asking myself, why can't I do as much as everyone else? Or why can't I do the same things as everyone else? But now I'm slowly starting to shift that mindset and sort of ask myself, what do I need to actually enjoy this? So sometimes that's leaving early. Sometimes it's saying no and saying, no, actually, I can't do that. I think that's been one of the biggest mindset shifts for me. And it is something that I'm still trying to do because I also hate saying no. Another thing that is very much alive in my life right now is I am constantly having new ideas pop up all the time. I'll have an idea for a book and then I will go headfirst into planning, and that's all I can think about. Super excited about it. And then another idea will come into my head, and I'll suddenly switch modes into that and completely forget about the other thing that I had already started working on. And that's actually something I struggle with a lot now because I have so many ideas every second of the day, and I don't have enough time or energy to execute them. And that frustrates the heck out of me. And if you haven't guessed it, this podcast is actually one of the projects that I have come up with, but I would like to keep this as a long term thing because I cannot stop spouting on about all of my knowledge and all of my lived experiences as well. But I actually think that it's a really positive thing because if you're anything like me, I have tried so many different things and I have learned so many different skills that I wouldn't have otherwise. And I think it's a really cool way to really find what lights you up, find what you are really passionate about. I know that there are a lot of people out there that talk about their new hyperfixation and their new hobby, and it's like hundreds of dollars down the drain. And people talk about their graveyard of hobbies in their cupboard. But honestly, I think that's one of the greatest joys in life is, doing new things and enjoying it. And then if you don't like it anymore, oh well, move on to the next thing. I really don't see anything wrong with that. I think it's a really cool way to learn more about yourself and learn what you actually like to do. So, to just touch on the teacher side of this, because this is called That AuDHD Teacher, I think if you are a teacher, you'll know that as teachers, one of the first things we are taught to do is that every child learns differently, or I hope that that is one of the very first things that you are taught to do. We don't expect every child to learn in exactly the same way and at the same pace. We adapt, we scaffold, we encourage, and we celebrate their strengths while supporting the areas of challenge, right? So, my question for you is when was the last time you offered yourself some of that grace? And how often do you expect yourself to think, work, socialize, organize, and cope exactly like everyone else? Because maybe the goal isn't to become like everyone else. Maybe it's to understand yourself well enough to build a life that works for your brain. I'll be honest, that is definitely something that I'm still building, something that I really need to work on. And maybe that's why this podcast exists, right? I think we're all in this together, we're all learning together. So, thank you so much for spending this time with me. Whether you're listening on your morning commute, you're out walking, you're doing some housework, I'm really, really grateful that you're here. And I really hope that every episode leaves you feeling a little bit more informed, hopefully, and most of all, understood and a little kinder to yourself. I hate saying that. My GP tells me that all the time, but she is very, very right. We need to be kind to ourselves. If today's conversation resonated with you, I'd love for you to follow That AuDHD Teacher on whatever platform you listen to your podcasts on, and also on social media. I'm also at That AuDHD Teacher. Sometimes I share little snippets and moments of my journey. I'm trying to anyway. And if there's any topics that you would like me to explore in any future episodes, I'd really love to hear from you. I would really love this podcast to be able to help build a community because, as much as I'm sharing my own story, I really want there to be a whole community of people behind it. So, this week, let's be curious, compassionate, and remember that different doesn't mean broken, it simply means different. So, take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next episode.